The day I found out my condo had already been rented out from under me, the place I'd owned for 6 years, the place I'd poured my savings into, the place that was supposed to be my safety net, I was standing in the middle of my mother-in-law's kitchen, holding a casserole dish and wearing an apron that said, "Home is where the heart is." I remember thinking that was the cruelest joke the universe had ever told, because at that exact moment, I didn't have a home anymore. My husband Brandon had signed a lease with a stranger without telling me a single word about it, and I was standing there serving dinner to his family like a well-trained golden retriever. Let me back up, because if I start there, you'll miss everything that matters. You'll miss how I got to that kitchen. You'll miss how a reasonably intelligent, financially independent woman ended up in an apron, hollow-eyed, spooning green bean casserole onto the plates of people who had been slowly dismantling her life for the better part of 2 years. You'll miss the part where I actually believed it was love. So let me start at the beginning. Or at least, the beginning of the part that counts. I was 31 when I met Brandon Kellerman. I had a 2-bedroom condo in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, that I'd bought on my own at 27. I was a project manager at a mid-size logistics company, making about $78,000 a year, with a 401k I actually contributed to, and a credit score that sat comfortably in the low 700s and 60s. I had a best friend named Danielle, who came over every other Friday for wine and terrible reality TV. I had a gym membership I used 3 times a week. I had a life that was, by most measurable standards, pretty solid. Brandon came into my world through a mutual friend's backyard barbecue on a Saturday in late June. He had this easy, slow smile and a way of listening to you that made you feel like the only person in the room. He was 34, worked in commercial real estate, drove a clean black Ford F-150, and had a laugh that I felt in my chest. We talked for 4 hours straight that first night, standing by the cooler long after everyone else had drifted inside. By the time I drove home, I was already thinking about him. We dated for 8 months before he asked me to move in with him. Or rather, he asked me to consider moving into his parents' house with him temporarily while he sorted out his living situation. He'd been renting an apartment, the lease was up, and he said he wanted to save money for a little while before we made a bigger decision together. It seemed reasonable. It seemed like the kind of practical thing 2 adults in a real relationship did. His parents, Karen and Dale Kellerman, lived about 20 minutes from my condo in a large 4-bedroom colonial in Westerville. His younger sister, Megan, had her own place nearby. I said I'd think about it. I had dinner with Danielle that week and laid out the whole situation over a bottle of Pinot Grigio. "Keep your condo," she said immediately. "Don't you dare give up that condo." I told her I wasn't planning to give it up. I was just going to rent it out while I stayed with Brandon and his parents for a few months. 6 months tops. Just until we figured out our next move as a couple. It felt smart, responsible even. The rental income would cover my mortgage and then some, and I'd be building equity while simultaneously deepening my relationship. I found a tenant, a young woman named Claire who worked at Ohio State, signed a 12-month lease, and moved into the Kellerman house with 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen things I couldn't live without. That was in February. The heat of the barbecue where I'd met Brandon felt very far away. Karen Kellerman was the kind of woman who greeted you with a hug that lasted just a half-second too long, the kind that said, "I'm sizing you up, not, I'm glad to see you." She was 62, retired from teaching, and ran her household the way a general runs a base. Everything had a system. The dishwasher was loaded a specific way. Towels were folded in thirds, not halves. Meals happened at the same time every day. She was pleasant enough on the surface, always asking about my work, always offering me coffee. But there was an undercurrent to her attention that I couldn't quite name yet. Like she was cataloging me, filing me away. Dale was quieter. He watched football, nodded a lot, and stayed out of whatever Karen decided. I think he'd learned long ago that the path of least resistance was the only path in that house. Brandon, in his parents' home, became a slightly different version of the man I'd fallen for at the barbecue. He was more relaxed, yes, but also more deferential. He'd glance at his mother before answering questions that had nothing to do with her. He'd defer to her opinions on things like where we should eat, what plans we should make on weekends, whether we needed an umbrella. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself don't matter. The first month wasn't bad. I cooked a few dinners, helped with groceries, kept my space tidy. Karen seemed to appreciate the effort. She told me once, while we were both in the kitchen, that it was so nice to have another woman in the house. I smiled and said I was happy to help out. I meant it genuinely. But somewhere in the second month, the dynamic started to shift in a way that was hard to pinpoint at first. Karen began assuming I'd handle certain things. Not asking, assuming. I'd come home from work on a Tuesday to find a note on the counter. Ashley, didn't get to the laundry, could you switch it over? Or I'd find a grocery list with a post-it that said, your turn, with a little smiley face. It was always framed cheerfully. It was always small. And every single time I brought it up gently to Brandon, he'd say something like, she's not trying to be demanding, she just forgets you work full-time too. Or, it's just how she is, babe, don't make it a thing. So I didn't make it a thing. Not yet. I told myself it was an adjustment period. I told myself 6 months wasn't that long. I told myself Brandon and I were building something real, and this was just a speed bump. What I didn't tell myself, what I refused to look at directly, was that my name wasn't on a single document in that house, that my condo was occupied by someone else, and that my entire sense of security was balanced on the goodwill of a woman who folded her towels in thirds and had never once, in 2 months, asked me how my day was without following it up with a favor. Then one evening in April, Brandon came home later than usual. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table while his parents were watching TV in the other room, and he said, very casually, like he was mentioning the weather, "Hey, so my buddy Marcus is looking for a place. I told him your condo might work out for him." I put down my fork. "What do you mean? Claire's lease doesn't end until January." He shrugged. "I just thought, if things work out with Marcus, maybe Claire could leave early. People do that." I stared at him. "Brandon, I can't just ask my tenant to leave because your friend needs a place." "I'm not saying kick her out," he said, and that slow smile appeared, the one I'd fallen for at the barbecue. "I'm just saying think about it. Marcus would pay good money, and honestly, January's not that far." I let it go. I told myself it was just a passing thought, a throwaway idea. He wasn't serious, he was just talking. But something about the way he'd said it, the casual entitlement of it, the way my condo was just a resource to be allocated, a problem to be solved for someone else's convenience, sat in my stomach like a stone for the rest of the night. And when I lay in bed next to him later, listening to him breathe easily into sleep, I found myself thinking about the deed to that condo, about whether it was still exactly where I'd left it, about whether I actually knew, with certainty, what was happening with my own property. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I trusted him. I pulled the covers up and closed my eyes and tried to sleep. I should have gotten up and checked. The paranoia didn't go away in the morning. It sat with me through my commute, through my 9 o'clock status meeting, through my lunch break where I ate a sad desk salad and stared at my phone. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Brandon had made an offhand comment about his friend Marcus, that was all. People say things like that all the time without meaning anything by them. It didn't mean he was actually going to do something with my property without asking me. That would be insane. That would be a level of entitlement so staggering that I couldn't even fully picture it. I called Danielle on my lunch break anyway. "He mentioned his friend needs a place," I said, and kind of floated the idea of using my condo. There was a pause on her end. "Your condo that has a tenant in it." "Yeah. A tenant with a lease." "A 12-month lease, yes." "Ashley." Her voice had that particular flatness it got when she was trying very hard not to say something alarming. "Keep an eye on that." I told her I would. I told her I was probably reading too much into it. She made a non-committal sound that meant she disagreed, but was choosing her battles, and we talked about something else for the rest of my lunch break. But when I hung up, that stone in my stomach hadn't moved an inch. May came, and with it, a slow suffocation that I was still refusing to name correctly. Karen had moved from leaving notes to simply telling me what needed to be done, usually in the mornings before I left for work. She'd catch me at the coffee maker and say something like, "Ashley, I'm expecting my book club girls Thursday evening, so if you could make sure the living room is straightened up by 6, that would be wonderful." Not a question, a calendar entry, with my name attached to it. I started keeping track. Not in a dramatic way, I didn't have a notebook or anything, but I started noticing the pattern with the kind of clarity that comes when you stop wanting to explain something away. In 1 week in mid-May, I had been asked to reorganize the pantry because Karen's system had gotten confused, pick up Dale's prescription because Karen had a hair appointment, make a grocery run for a specific brand of sparkling water that Karen liked and that wasn't at the nearest store, and sit with Megan, who had come over for dinner on a Tuesday without warning, and listen to a 45-minute breakdown about Megan's coworker drama while Brandon and his parents watched TV in the other room. That last one was the one that broke something open in me a little, because Megan and I had never been close. She was 29, perfectly pleasant on the surface, but she had this way of looking at me that reminded me of Karen, that same cataloging quality, that same subtle assessment. She didn't come over to spend time with me. She came over for her parents and her brother. And somehow I had ended up cast as the audience for her problems while my boyfriend sat 20 feet away watching ESPN. I brought it up to Brandon that night. We were in the guest room, his old room technically, still decorated with a shelf of college football trophies and a faded Ohio State pennant. And I sat on the edge of the bed and said, carefully, I feel like I'm being used as a household resource, Brandon. Like, not as your girlfriend, but as a convenience. He looked up from his phone. What do you mean? I mean, your mom asks me to do things every single day. Not asks, actually, tells. And tonight I spent almost an hour listening to Megan talk about her job while you were in the other room. She was just venting, babe. To me? Why to me? We're not even that close. He set his phone down, which I took as a sign he was actually going to engage. Because you're good at listening, he said, and he said it like it was a compliment, like I was supposed to feel flattered. Mom says you have a calming energy. I stared at him. Brandon, I'm not a service. I'm your girlfriend. No one's saying you're a service. Then why does it feel like I have a job description in this house and no one consulted me before writing it? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think you're being a little sensitive, Ashley. This is a temporary situation. You knew it would take some adjustment. I did know that. I had known it. But there's a difference between adjusting to a new living situation and slowly being absorbed into an unpaid domestic role in someone else's house. I tried to explain that distinction, and he nodded along in the way people do when they've already decided you're wrong but don't want to fight about it. We went to sleep with the conversation technically over and nothing actually resolved. The next morning, Karen made me coffee without asking and handed it to me with a warm smile and said, Brandon tells me you've been a little stressed lately. You know, dear, this house runs better when everyone pitches in. It's just what family does. Family. I held my coffee cup with both hands and said, Of course, and smiled back at her. That word sat in my chest all day like a splinter. It was the last Friday in May when things escalated in a way I couldn't rationalize away. I came home from work to find a man I didn't recognize standing in the front hallway talking to Brandon and Dale. He was mid-40s, heavyset, wearing a Carhartt jacket and holding a cup of Karen's coffee like he'd been there a while. Brandon turned when I came in and said, Hey, Ashley, this is Marcus. I felt the blood drain from my face so fast I actually gripped the doorframe. Marcus, I repeated. Marcus Webb, the man said, extending his hand with a friendly nod. Good to finally put a face to the name. I shook his hand on autopilot. My brain was doing rapid calculations. Finally put a face to the name. Which meant Brandon had been talking about me to this man. Specifically, I realized, Brandon had been talking about my condo. Marcus is looking for a longer-term rental situation, Brandon said, with the casual ease of someone who had no idea, or was pretending to have no idea, that my heart had just stopped. We've been talking about options. What options? I said. Well, you know, your place could work out really well for him. It's the right size, right location. He said it like we'd already discussed this, like it was a plan in progress. Brandon, I said, and something in my voice must have landed differently than usual because Dale quietly excused himself to the kitchen and Marcus suddenly became very interested in his coffee. Can I talk to you for a second? Privately. We went to the back hallway. I pulled the door mostly closed and turned to face him. What is happening right now? I asked. I told you about Marcus, he said, and there it was, that slight defensiveness, that preemptive framing of himself as reasonable. We talked about this. You mentioned him once, casually. I said no. You said you'd think about it. I said Claire has a lease. Claire's lease ends in January, he said, and now his voice had shifted into something more deliberate. And Marcus is offering to pay $1,400 a month, which is 300 more than Claire pays. I thought you'd want to hear the full picture. I stood there. $1,400. He'd already negotiated a number. He'd already gotten far enough into a conversation with this man that they had discussed monthly rent on my property, without me in the room. Did you tell Marcus he could rent my condo? I asked. Brandon looked at the wall. I said it was likely. The hallway felt very small suddenly. You said it was likely. I didn't make any promises. I didn't want to waste his time if it wasn't going to happen. Brandon. I kept my voice very even because I could feel how close I was to losing it completely. That is my condo. I own it. You have no authority to tell anyone anything about it without talking to me first. I know that, he said. And he actually sounded slightly contrite for a second. I was going to tell you tonight. I didn't think you'd be home this early. And that was almost worse. The plan had been to tell me after the fact, once Marcus was already sitting in our hallway with his coffee and his expectations. Once the social pressure of disappointing a real person in a real room made it harder for me to say no. I walked back out, told Marcus it was lovely to meet him, but that there had been a miscommunication and the condo wasn't going to be available. And I went upstairs and called Danielle and talked in a low, shaking voice for 20 minutes while sitting on the bathroom floor. Ashley, she said when I was done, you need to call Claire. Why? Because I want you to confirm with your own ears, directly from your tenant, that she is still in that condo and everything is still fine. I called Claire that same evening, sitting in my car in the Kellerman's driveway, because I didn't want anyone in the house to hear me. Claire picked up on the third ring and she sounded perfectly normal, perfectly settled, talking about how she'd just repotted some plants on the balcony. The lease was solid. She wasn't going anywhere until January. Nothing had changed. I exhaled so hard I fogged up my own windshield. For about 2 weeks after that, things were actually better. Brandon apologized, not profusely, not on his knees, but he said he understood he'd overstepped and he wouldn't go around me like that again. Karen was slightly warmer, slightly less demanding. Megan didn't come over for a Sunday dinner, which felt like a small mercy. I started to think maybe the Marcus incident had been a wake-up call. Maybe it had recalibrated something. Maybe I'd been heard. I let myself feel relieved. I let myself believe it. That was my mistake. Because 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening in mid-June, I was sitting at the kitchen table going through my work emails when my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. A direct deposit I wasn't expecting. $1,400 exactly from a sender listed only as M. Webb. I set my phone down on the table very slowly. I picked it up again. I read the amount and the name a second time, then a third. My hands had gone completely cold. Marcus Webb had paid me $1,400 in rent, which meant someone had given him my banking information, which meant a lease, or something close enough to one, had already been signed, which meant Claire, my tenant, my carefully vetted Ohio State employee who repotted plants on my balcony, was somehow already out of the picture, and I had not known any of it was happening until this exact moment, reading a deposit notification at a kitchen table in someone else's house. I stood up. The chair scraped back loudly. Across the kitchen, Karen looked up from the counter where she was slicing tomatoes, and the expression on her face in that one unguarded second before she rearranged it into something neutral told me everything I needed to know. She knew. She already knew. "Where's Brandon?" I said. Her knife kept moving. "He mentioned he might stop by Marcus's place this evening, actually, to help him get settled." The room tilted. "Get settled?" I repeated. "He's such a good friend," Karen said, and smiled at the tomatoes. I walked out of that kitchen, out the front door, and sat down on the front porch steps in the June evening air, and I called Danielle, and this time my voice wasn't shaking. It was completely, terrifyingly flat. "He rented out my condo," I said, "to Marcus. It's already done. I just got the deposit." There was a silence on her end that lasted long enough to tell me she was choosing her next words with extreme care. "Ashley," she said finally, "you need to find out exactly what he signed and when, and then you need to call an attorney, tonight if you can." I sat in that driveway for a long time after I hung up with Danielle. The June air was warm and thick, the kind of evening where fireflies should have been drifting across the lawn and everything should have felt easy. Instead, I sat in my car with my hands in my lap and looked at the Kellerman's front door and tried to understand how I had gotten here, how I had let this happen. Because that was the part that was starting to cut deeper than Brandon's betrayal. The fact that somewhere along the way, I had stopped paying attention to my own life. I had handed the wheel to someone else and told myself it was love. I called an attorney's office that night. Not a full consultation, it was past 7, nobody was picking up. But I left a message for a woman named Rachel Odom, whose name Danielle had texted me approximately 40 seconds after I told her what happened. "She handled my cousin's divorce," Danielle said. "She is not someone you want to be on the wrong side of. Call her." I left a message that was probably too long and not coherent enough, but I said the words, "my property," and "signed without my consent," and "I need to understand what my legal options are," and I hung up and sat there in the dark car feeling, for the first time in months, like I had done something that was entirely mine. Then I went inside and everything fell apart in a different direction. Brandon was home. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the kind of prepared stillness that told me he'd known I was outside for a while and had spent the time deciding how to play this. Karen was in the living room. I could hear the television. Dale was probably asleep in his recliner. The house smelled like the pot roast Karen had made for dinner, and I hadn't eaten a single bite of it. And the domesticity of all of it felt like a taunt. "We need to talk," I said. "I know," Brandon said. He didn't look guilty exactly. He looked like a man who had made a calculation and was now managing the fallout. I sat down across from him. I put my phone on the table between us, face up, with the banking notification still visible. The $1,400 from M. Webb. "Explain this to me," I said. He let out a slow breath. "Claire's lease was terminated early. She agreed to it. She got 2 months free and her full deposit back." I felt sick. "You paid her to leave. With what money?" Marcus fronted it. "Brandon." I pressed both hands flat on the table. "You made a financial arrangement involving my property, using money from a third party, without my knowledge or consent, and you moved a tenant out of my condo, a tenant I found, vetted, and signed a lease with. And you did all of this while I was living in your parents' house thinking we were in a relationship. We are in a relationship. You treated my condo like a business asset you had authority over," I said. "You don't. You have never had authority over my property." He shifted in his chair. "Marcus needed a place. It made financial sense. You're getting more per month than you were getting from Claire." "That's not the point." "I think it kind of is the point, Ashley. You're getting paid. Marcus is happy. Claire got compensated and she was actually fine with it. She told me she'd been thinking about moving closer to campus anyway. Everyone came out okay." I stared at him. The sheer architecture of that reasoning, the way it was constructed to make me sound unreasonable for objecting, was breathtaking. "You gave a stranger my banking information," I said quietly. Something crossed his face, just for a second, the barest flicker of something that might have been shame. "I needed to set up the payment system." "You gave a stranger my banking information," I repeated, "without asking me. Brandon, do you understand how serious that is?" "Marcus isn't a stranger. He's my friend." "He's a stranger to me." I stood up. "He is a complete stranger to me, and he is now in possession of my account details. He is living in my condo under an arrangement I did not agree to, and you apparently feel that all of this is fine because the math worked out in my favor." Brandon stood up too. "I was trying to help." "You were trying to solve a problem for your friend and you used my property to do it. That's not helping me, Brandon. That's using me." His jaw tightened. "You want to be difficult about this? Fine. But Marcus signed a lease and he moved in 3 days ago. You can't just undo that." 3 days ago. He'd moved in 3 days ago. I'd been living in this house, cooking dinner, switching over laundry, listening to Megan's problems, and all of that time, a man I had never met was sleeping in my condo. For 3 days. I went upstairs. I did not say goodnight. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and I called Danielle back and told her what Brandon had said, and she was so quiet on the other end that I finally asked if she was still there. "I'm here," she said. "I'm trying to figure out how to say this." "Just say it." "Ashley, you have to get out of that house." "I know." "No, I mean, not eventually. I mean, soon. Like, this week kind of soon. Because you have no legal standing there. That's not your house. And Brandon has already demonstrated that he will make decisions about your property without your knowledge. As long as you're under that roof, you're at a disadvantage. I lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. The Ohio State pennant was faded at one corner. I had slept under it for 4 months. I don't have anywhere to go, I said. My condo has a tenant. You can stay with me, she said, immediately, no hesitation. I have the pull-out couch. It's not forever, but you need to not be there. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Brandon, who fell asleep with depressing ease, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle, and thought about how I had gotten here. I thought about the day I'd moved in with 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen things. I thought about the lease I'd signed with Claire, how careful I'd been, how I'd run a credit check and called her references and felt proud of myself for being thorough. I thought about how all of that thoroughness had been undone by a conversation I wasn't in the room for. By 4 in the morning, I had a plan. Not a complete one, not a good one necessarily, but something that was mine. The attorney called me back at 8:15 the next morning while I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of my office building. Rachel Odom had a voice like someone who had heard everything and was still paying attention. I explained the situation in as much detail as I could manage. She asked several questions I hadn't anticipated: whether my name was the only name on the deed, whether Brandon and I were married or just cohabiting, whether the lease with Marcus was in writing, whether I had a copy of the original lease I'd signed with Claire. The deed is in my name only, I said. We're not married. I don't have a copy of whatever Brandon signed with Marcus, and yes, I have a copy of Claire's original lease. Okay, she said, here's where you are. Your property is yours. Brandon had no legal authority to terminate Claire's lease or enter into a new one. Whatever he signed with Marcus Webb is not a valid lease because he is not the property owner and had no power of attorney or any other legal standing to act on your behalf. The deposit Marcus paid you is interesting. It's essentially rent paid to the wrong party by way of an unauthorized arrangement. This is a mess, but it's not an unsolvable one. Something in my chest cracked open, not in a bad way, in the way that a window cracks when there's been no air in the room for too long. What do I do? I asked. First, you come in and we talk properly. I have an opening Thursday at 2. Second, you don't discuss any of this with Brandon or his family until after we talk. Third, and I cannot stress this enough, document everything. The deposit notification, any texts Brandon sent about Marcus, anything Karen said. Screenshot it all and send it to your own email. Right now, today. Karen made a comment last night, I said. When I asked where Brandon was, she said he'd gone to help Marcus get settled. Like she knew. There was a brief pause. Document that too, Rachel said. Even if it's just a note you write to yourself with the date and time and exactly what was said. Details matter. We hung up and I sat in that parking lot for another 10 minutes. Then I got out of my car, walked into my office, and spent the first 45 minutes of my workday doing exactly what Rachel had told me to do. I went through every text thread I had with Brandon and screenshotted every message that mentioned Marcus, the condo, money, or anything even adjacent to the arrangement he'd made. I found 3 texts where he'd referenced Marcus and the condo in ways that were vague enough that he could probably explain them away individually, but together painted a picture. I emailed them all to myself. Then I opened a new document and typed out everything Karen had said the night before, with the timestamp and the exact words as closely as I could recall them. I saved it to my personal drive, not my work one. Then I did my actual job for the rest of the day, because my mortgage wasn't going to pay itself, and I was going to need every dollar of financial stability I had in the coming weeks. That Thursday, I sat in Rachel Odom's office, which smelled like good coffee and old paper, and she walked me through my options with the kind of clarity that felt almost physical after months of things being murky. The unauthorized lease arrangement was legally unenforceable. Marcus Webb had no valid tenancy because the person who'd signed him in had no authority to do so. The money he'd deposited could be addressed in several ways, and my immediate priority, Rachel said, was to get myself into a stable housing situation and then deal with the property question from a position of security rather than desperation. You're not trapped, she said. I know it probably feels like you are, but you own that condo outright. Well, with a mortgage, but it's yours. That's significant. That's leverage. I nodded. My hands were folded in my lap and I was holding them very still because otherwise they would have been shaking. I'm going to move out of his parents' house this weekend, I said. Rachel looked at me steadily. Good, she said. Do it quietly. Don't announce it, don't argue about it. Just go. I drove from her office to Danielle's apartment and sat on her couch and told her everything Rachel had said. Danielle listened with her legs pulled up under her and a mug of tea going cold in her hands, and when I finished, she put the mug down and said, "So what do you need from me?" "I need to borrow your truck," I said. "Saturday morning, early." She didn't even hesitate. "Done," she said. "What time do you want to leave?" I went back to the Kellerman's house that evening, and I was pleasant and calm, and I helped Karen make dinner, and I sat at the table, and I ate, and I answered questions about my week, and I smiled when Brandon put his hand over mine, and I did not say a single word about Rachel Odom or Thursday's meeting or what was coming. Karen talked about her book club. Dale asked about the weather forecast for the weekend. Megan texted Brandon something that made him laugh. I watched all of it with the particular detachment that comes when you've already made a decision and you're just waiting for the moment to act on it. I was still sitting at their table, but I was already gone. And for the first time in months, that felt like a beginning instead of an ending. Saturday morning, I was up at 5:30. Moving through the Kellerman's house in the gray, pre-dawn quiet, like I was diffusing something. I had packed the night before, methodically, while Brandon slept. 2 suitcases, same as I'd arrived with. The box of kitchen things I'd brought from my condo. My laptop bag, my important documents folder, deed, lease copies, pay stubs, everything Rachel had told me to keep close. I moved carefully, slowly, not because I was afraid of waking anyone, but because I wanted to be deliberate. I wanted every choice I made in that house to be intentional. Danielle pulled up at 6:03 in her truck, headlights off, and I carried everything down in 2 trips. The June morning air was cool and smelled like cut grass from someone's yard down the block. I put my suitcases in the truck bed and my laptop bag in the cab, and I stood on the Kellerman's front lawn for exactly 3 seconds looking at the house. The curtains in the master bedroom were still. No movement anywhere. I got in the truck, and Danielle pulled away without either of us saying a word. We were 2 blocks away when she finally spoke. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. And I meant it in the technical sense. I wasn't crying, I wasn't shaking, I wasn't falling apart. I was operating. "Ask me again in about a week." She nodded and turned onto the highway and put on a playlist she'd made that was exactly the right combination of driving music and not asking me to feel things right now. And I watched Columbus wake up through the passenger window and let myself breathe. Brandon called at 8:47. I watched his name light up on my phone screen and let it go to voicemail. Karen called 20 minutes after that. I let that go too. I was sitting at Danielle's kitchen table eating toast and going through my emails, and when the voicemails came in, I listened to them both, once, and then I forwarded them to Rachel Odom's office with a note that said, "For the record." Brandon's voicemail was confused and slightly irritated. He said he didn't understand where I'd gone. He said we needed to talk. He said I was being dramatic. Karen's was warmer and more dangerous. She said she hoped everything was okay. She said she knew things had been stressful. She said the door was always open. That one made me feel something I hadn't expected, not warmth, but a kind of cold clarity. Because Karen had known about Marcus. She'd known for days, maybe longer, and she had stood in that kitchen the night I found out and talked about her book club like nothing was happening. The warmth in her voicemail was performance, and I was done watching the show. I met with Rachel again the following Tuesday. By then, I had done exactly what she'd told me to do. Documented everything, gathered everything, kept my mouth shut with everyone except Danielle. Rachel had spent the intervening days doing her own research, and when I sat down across from her desk, she had a yellow legal pad with notes in her handwriting and the kind of expression that told me she'd found something worth telling me. "The arrangement Brandon made with Marcus Webb is not legally enforceable," she said. "Brandon has no authority to enter into a rental agreement on your behalf. He is not on the deed, he has no power of attorney, and you did not give verbal or written consent. Whatever document he gave Marcus is essentially worthless as a lease." "So Marcus has no legal right to be in my condo," I said. "Correct. He's what we'd call a tenant at sufferance at best, meaning he's there without legal authority. You can move to have him removed, and given the circumstances, I think you'd have a strong position." I took a breath. "What about the $1,400 he deposited?" "That's yours. It came into your account. You didn't solicit it under false pretenses. That was Brandon's doing. You keep it, and if Marcus wants it back as part of any dispute, that's between him and Brandon. Something in my chest that had been clenched for weeks loosened by about 10%. Not fully, but enough to feel like blood was moving again. What are my next steps? I asked. I send a formal notice to Marcus Webb at the property address, informing him that his tenancy is unauthorized and he has 30 days to vacate. I also send a cease and desist to Brandon Kellerman, informing him that he is not to take any action regarding your property, contact your bank, or represent himself as having any authority over your assets. And I strongly recommend you change your banking information. Today, if you can. I was already reaching for my phone before she finished the sentence. That afternoon, I went to my bank in person, sat across from a woman named Gail who had been there through my original mortgage application and had always been kind to me, and I explained, as calmly as I could, that my account information had been shared without my consent and I needed to change everything. Gail was professional and efficient and did not ask unnecessary questions, but at one point she looked up from her keyboard and said, quietly, "Honey, I'm so sorry this happened to you." I had to look at the wall for a second because I wasn't going to cry in a bank branch. Rachel's letters went out that Wednesday. I know because she emailed me the tracking numbers. Marcus Webb received his notice on Friday morning. I know because he called me at 11:15 that same day, which meant he'd gotten my number from Brandon, which meant Brandon had given it to him, which was one more item on a list that was getting longer by the day. I didn't answer. I texted Rachel the missed call and she texted back a single word. Good. Brandon texted me 17 times between Saturday morning and the following Monday. I read every one of them and responded to none. They started confused and moved through hurt and landed somewhere around defensive, which, in my experience, is where people go when they know they've done something wrong and have decided that offense is better than accountability. The last text he sent before Monday was, "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be. I was trying to help our future." I read that one 3 times. Our future. The one where he made decisions about my property without telling me. The one where I lived in his parents' house, switching over laundry and listening to his sister's problems. That future. I put my phone face down and went back to work. The confrontation I'd been bracing for happened on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after I left. I was at Danielle's making pasta when my phone showed Brandon calling again. This time, something made me pick up. Maybe I was ready. Maybe I was just tired of waiting. Ashley. His voice was different than the texts, less composed, more raw. "We need to actually talk, not through lawyers. I have nothing to say to you that isn't better handled through Rachel," I said. Rachel. He said her name like it tasted bad. "You hired an attorney over a rental arrangement." "I hired an attorney because you signed a lease on my property without my knowledge or consent and gave a stranger my banking information," I said. "Which is not a rental arrangement, Brandon. That's fraud adjacent at minimum." "That's insane. I wasn't defrauding you. Marcus paid you more money than Claire was." And there it was, the thing he kept coming back to, the thing he genuinely seemed to believe settled the matter. I set my wooden spoon down on the counter and I said, very clearly, "Brandon, I want you to listen to me. The amount of money is not the point. The point is that I did not consent. My property, my bank account, my tenant relationship, none of those are yours to manage. Not because we're fighting, but because they were never yours to manage. Not once, in the entire time we were together, did I give you any authority over my financial life or my property. You took it, without asking. And then you acted like I should be grateful because the math worked out." Silence on his end. A long one. "I thought we were building something together," he finally said, and his voice had dropped into something that sounded genuinely hurt. And for 1 second, just one, I felt the pull of it. The old pull. The man from the barbecue with the slow smile and the way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. Then I thought about Karen's face in that kitchen. That one unguarded second before she rearranged it into something neutral. She knew. She already knew. "You were building something," I said. "I was being used as a resource. Those are different things." I paused. "Don't contact me outside of what Rachel's office handles. I mean that." I hung up. I stood at Danielle's stove for a moment with my hand still on my phone. Then I picked up the spoon and finished making the pasta. Marcus vacated the condo on the 28th day of his 30-day notice. Rachel had told me to expect pushback, possible delay, possible negotiation. There was none of it. He left clean, which honestly surprised me, and which I later found out was because Brandon had told him the legal situation was worse than he'd let on. And Marcus, who was not the villain of this story and never really had been, decided a rental dispute wasn't worth his time. He sent me a text from a number I didn't save that said only, "No hard feelings. Your ex created this mess, not you." I didn't respond, but I didn't delete it either. I moved back into my condo on a Saturday in late July. Danielle helped me carry things up. It was empty and a little echoey, and it smelled faintly like someone else's fabric softener, but it was mine. Every square foot of it, legally and completely mine. I stood in the middle of the living room with a box of kitchen things in my arms, and I looked at the balcony where Claire had repotted her plants, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Solid ground. I changed all the locks that afternoon. Danielle held the new keys while I worked the hardware, and she said, "This is the most satisfying thing I've ever witnessed." And I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. Real laughter, not the performed kind I'd been using at Karen's dinner table. I found a new tenant in August. A woman named Priya, a software engineer, meticulous references, credit score better than mine. She signed a 14-month lease and paid the first month plus security deposit without blinking. I deposited the check myself, at my bank, into an account that had new numbers and that no one else had access to. Rachel Odom sent me her final invoice in September. It was not a small number. I paid it the same day it arrived because there are some things that are worth every single dollar, and having someone in your corner who knows exactly what to do when your life is being dismantled without your permission is one of them. I wrote, "Thank you," in the memo line. She sent back a one-line email. "You did the hard part. I just handled the paperwork." Brandon and I have not spoken since that phone call. I heard through a mutual friend, the same one from the backyard barbecue where I'd met him, that he moved back into his own apartment eventually, that Marcus found somewhere else, that Karen apparently told several people in their social circle that I had overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. I filed that away under things that no longer required my energy and moved on. My 401k contribution went back up to full in October, once I'd rebuilt my emergency fund to where it needed to be. My credit score, which had dipped slightly during the chaos of it all, climbed back into the 700s and 60s by November. I went back to the gym. Danielle came over on the other Fridays for wine and terrible reality TV, except now she came to my place, and we sat on my couch in my condo, and it felt exactly like it was supposed to feel. I think about the apron sometimes, the one that said, "Home is where the heart is." I left it on the hook in Karen's kitchen the morning I walked out. I don't know if that was intentional or if I just forgot it, but I'm glad it's not here. Because the thing I've learned, the thing I really had to live through to understand, is that home isn't where someone else allows you to exist. Home is what you build, on your own terms, with your own name on the deed. And when someone tries to take that from you, the answer isn't to adjust and accommodate and smile at the dinner table and tell yourself it's just a speed bump. The answer is to call a woman named Rachel Odom and change your locks and carry your own boxes up the stairs and stand in your own living room on your own solid ground. And breathe.